Welcome back to another Box Score Geek show. We are officially in 2020, new show of the new year, so we'll be talking chess. Don't worry, I'll get to all that in a second. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers. With me, as always, is my producer, voice of God, man of many hats. Happy New Year, Brian.
Happy New Year, Dre. It's only the second already, and we've got crazy stuff going on in the world, but I'm here happy to talk to you about chess and the NBA. You know, we got these small mercies.
I'll say that it was funny because, like, before the show, you're like, if we can avoid talking about the world, that's fine. I was, like, reading Twitter, and I, like, had to close a thread. So, you know what? We can call this the ostrich show or something, Brian. Stick our head in the sand. There has been a ton of NBA going on. As we kind of joked about, we were the load management podcast basically after Thanksgiving, off every other week, just scheduling conflicts, friends and family. Had a fun set of trip experiences. Brian managed to both miss a flight on the way out of town to family. And this is amazing, Brian. So on the 23rd, I missed a flight out of town, managed to rebook and get into town only 5 hours later, which was freaking incredible. This was on the 23rd, and this was remarkable. In the Appleton airport, there was one person manning the desks for both United and Delta. So it was a little ridiculous. So I was amazed that happened. Then on the way home, we had our flight canceled and then another flight delayed and had to run through an airport. So it has been a fun Christmas travel time. I am happy to be home, happy to be back talking about other stuff. But, you know, that meant we missed a few weeks of NBA news, and we have lots to discuss there. We're going to miss a ton. Basically, the two things I wanted to focus on this show, Brian, to dip our toes back in NBA news is, first off, chess. Who doesn't want to talk the World Blitz Chess Championship, Brian? Obviously, the most pertinent basketball news. And then I wanted to talk an amazing press conference by Coach Carlisle on Kristaps Poringis. And then anything else we get in my opinion, is just gravy. So yeah, I'll give our sponsor, and then we can get to it. So our official sponsor is dailyroto.com. If you use promo code nerdnumbers at dailyroto.com, they are your one-stop shop for daily fantasy sports. Football's almost over, but of course we're in full swing for basketball, hockey. You like college sports, baseball will be coming up soon. If you need an optimizer, tools for researching, analyzing, go to dailyroto.com. Use promo code nerdnumbers. It'll get you 10% off. You have to have heard of daily fantasy sports at this time. Go for it. Unofficial sponsor, Brian, I'm going to say Gardetto's. So I had a bunch of Gardetto's snacks in my backpack for the trip. As a joke, my family gave us some as stocking stuffers. So those worked amazingly well on my child on the airplane. So I'm giving Gardetto's the unofficial sponsor slot on the show because they kept a child from screaming on an airplane, which is a small miracle. So Gardetto's, if you're looking for a snack to keep your child distracted on an airplane, Gardetto's.
The ride ship is the best one, right, Dre? Isn't that universally agreed?
I think this is an interesting point of contention because you are not the first person I've heard say that. It is like my least favorite one of those.
Wow.
And I know, right? So this is a question to the audience. The rye chip and Gardetto's snacks, is it your favorite, least favorite? They used to have a little sesame seed breadstick, but they removed the sesame. Those were good. That was my favorite. But Gardetto's as a whole, you know, it's not hard to go wrong with carbs and salt, Brian, right? You just carbs and salt together. If you added sugar, you know, it'd be as American as possible. All right, Brian. So like I said, two topics, chess and Porzingis, sorry, not Jokic. And then we might actually get into some Jokic. We'll jump around the NBA as well. And then, of course, realize this wasn't on the original script, but it was a late-minute addition. We were going to try and go earlier in the week. For those that don't know, this week was the New Year, and people tend to do stuff for that. Brian, I forgot it was the New Year like 4 times, which was a joke because I was like, "Hey, want to record a podcast tonight?" And you're like, "It's New Year's Eve."
I wanted to, but we didn't quite get there.
The fun celebration. I've officially turned into a parent. We drank Crown Royale and cola and watched old Sex and the City reruns. So it was a very, very old coupley New Year for myself and my wife. Yeah, it was enjoyable. But because we put off the show past our normal Monday start time, unfortunate news, David Stern has passed, and there have been some interesting commentary that we're going to have to discuss too. So I'll say those are our 3 topics. Chess, Porzingis Postups, David Stern passing than anything else that hits our fancy. So why do I want to talk chess? This is a subject that keeps coming up on the show, Brian. I know you've heard me ramble quite a bit, and you get to hear some more. Is I love comparing chess to conventional sports we love because in the realm of analytics, chess is really what everybody is hoping all sports analytics is. An example I give, so apologies, I'm going to say his name wrong, but I believe it's Oliver over at 538 did some amazing work on the Chess World Championship earlier. So it's Oliver Roeder, I believe, or Roeder. I hope I'm not missing a accent or something. But
Could
Oliver
be
Roeder
Reader also, but I think it's Roeder.
I hope Roeder did some amazing analysis of the Chess World Championships in 2018. And the reason I loved it is chess, unlike other sports, has these win probability charts. And I don't want to say I don't believe, but some of the win probability charts for other sports are interesting to me. And I put an example on the script in 2017. So apparently the Falcons were supposed to be a 99% favorite to beat the Patriots before losing on a confluence of just bad calls and bad luck. And this has always interested me, right? Because you see these win probability charts for basketball, football, and these are obviously to a degree estimated by some priors or some model that some person has come up with. And I'm not saying these models are wrong, although question to the audience, if any audience member out there is really bored and looking for an analytics assignment, I'd really love to see how well these win probability charts line up with reality. Because, this Falcons one isn't even the first one I can think of that, is just this bizarre gap. And, a football season is only, 16 games per team, 30 teams. That's, 480, 240 games, right? Because you do 16 times 30 divided by 2. So 480 games or 230 game or 240, whatever the math is. Apologies, I might be getting it wrong. That's not a lot of games. So if something's like 99%, that would mean you'd expect to see it maybe twice a season, even in 2 to 3 times a season, even including playoffs. And yet I think it's, a story at least several times a year to see one of these charts just get absolutely skewed. And the reason is, sports are weird. There's no hard and fast rule about how things go beyond just the realm of possibility, right? As soon as you hit a certain point in football, you can kneel out the clock. So it's physically impossible to win. Whereas there might be times where they're you're up by 3 touchdowns in the fourth. It should be impossible. Do you remember the game this year, Brian? My brother was telling me about it. They got essentially 3 onside kicks. So it was the first time ever there'd been 2 successful onside kicks to come back, but they also had a penalty on a successful onside kick conversion. So it was this team did 3 successful onside kicks in a game, which is unheard of. Am I misremembering something?
No, I don't remember it, but it probably happened. Onside kicks happen a lot.
Anyway, they happen a lot, but just getting multiple successful onside kicks in a game is pretty rare. So with all that said, win probability charts for normal sports are hard, but in chess they're perfect because what you have is these perfect chess engines, which is, programs that can run on, on your phone at this point and know with really good certainty who's doing better and by how much and what percentage of the time, if everybody played perfectly, they should win. And so again, I showed a 538 article from the Chess World Championships that shows these perfect charts of here was the state of every game after every move for this thing. So chess is perfect in that regard. Also, chess has a rating system, the Elow system, which people have tried to copy for professional sports. And I've explained before, copying the Elow system for professional sports doesn't work because Elow assumes consistent strength, or at least consistently moving strength by opponents. And the problem is, in basketball, if I try and give the Spurs an Elow rating and then Tim Duncan is injured or is on a back-to-back, so is on a minutes restriction, that is a much different team than, what Popovich is going to do in the playoffs. So trying to do an Elow rating system for professional sports teams doesn't make a lot of sense because the essential assumption behind an Elow rating system is consistent strength and that we are expecting to see the same strength show up game after game. And you are able to use this Elow rating system to compare the difference of strength between opponents to upgrade, if one opponent's getting better or worse. And so I love chess for this, right? There's a perfect rating system for players. Since it's an individual sport, we don't have the messiness of team dynamics. We have perfect analysis to tell you who is winning and by how much in any game. That's great. And then the reason I love comparing it to normal sports is in spite of all this, in spite of essentially having a perfect rating system, a perfect dynamic to know who's winning and by how much, it still falls into some of the classic sports foibles. And the two I'll give you is, first off, they have a bullshit playoff system. And so to determine the world chess champion, there's the defending champion, the person who's defending the crown. Now, in theory, what you should be able to do is just go and say, who is the second best person in the world using the Elow rating system? And that's what I would do. But what they do is they have this candidates tournament where they basically select a subset of the best players in the world and have them play a ranked tournament, and whoever ends up with the strongest score at the end of the tournament gets to vie for the world championship. And while this is fun, this falls into all of the problems we have in normal sports, like the NBA in particular. The NBA, because they have a conference system, means that sometimes the teams coming out east, like LeBron James, if LeBron James on the Cavaliers had played a fair weighted playoff system. So by that, what I mean is, let's say, excluding SRS. SRS is a weighting system that you can find at Basketball Reference that uses strength of schedule and point margin. Point margin is how much you outscore your opponent by an average. Combines those two to give an estimated rating of how good each team in the NBA is. So that's what you could use in the NBA. But let's just go by win-loss record, which, does have the flaws of different strength of schedules, right? Teams like the Utah Jazz and Denver Nuggets have better home courts just because of, altitude and stuff. Just do win-loss record. If you had done that and the Cleveland Cavaliers had to play, whatever seed they were when they won 50 games or whatever, instead of being the number 2 or number 3 seed when LeBron James was playing with the Cleveland Cavaliers and they came on some of their title runs, they would have been a lower seed and likely would have fallen much earlier in the playoffs, especially if they had played cross-conference. But that doesn't happen, right? And chess is the same way. Instead of just saying the world champion should play the second best player in the world, they have this really hard tournament where even if you are the second best player in the world at chess, if you have to play a tournament against a bunch of other good players, there's just a really reasonable shot that you might not win or you might lose by a small margin because these players are so good that, they're expected to draw a majority of the time. Case in point, last year's World Chess Championship, this is normal chess over the board for long periods of time where, they can sit and think. That chess championship ended with 6 draws apiece. It was a best of 12. And both players got 12 draws, right? Obviously, so both players drew every game. They were that close to each other in skill that they were able to basically ensure that neither player won either game. And so, when you've got some of the best players in the world playing each other in a tournament, the difference between who gets to go on to fight for the world championship and the person who sits at home could be, half of a rating point. And I know I put this on the script, Brian. Basically, in the last 15 years, only 2 players, Magnus Carlsen, the defending world champion currently, and Fabiano Caruana, who fought for the championship last year. That's the last 2 times in 15 years, and they do every 2 to 3 years, that the best player in the world has gotten the title shot, if that makes sense. So it has a really silly playoff system. And then also, this was the reason this actually got on my radar, Brian, is they have a designated hitter issue. So in baseball, for those that aren't baseball fans, I'm shocked you're listening to the show, but whatever. In baseball, they have what's known as the designated hitter rule. So in the American League, the teams are allowed to take the pitcher, if they want, not have the pitcher bat and have someone else bat instead. You can basically have a full-time batter if you would like. Whereas in the National League, the pitcher has to bat. And so this is a hugely different rule set because in one league, you have a person that really can't bat in a batting position, whereas in the other league, you have a person who can bat in the batting position. And this has to do with all sorts of weird arbitrary cutoffs when baseball was split into different leagues, et cetera. And that's really bizarre. In chess, what they have is in the United States chess system, if a player runs out of time and their opponent does not have what's known as mating material, meaning they could force a checkmate with the pieces they have on the board. If in the U.S. chess system, if they do not have that system, it's a draw. Whereas if they do have that and the other person runs out of time, it's a win. In the FIDE system, you do not have to have mating material. You do not have to have a guaranteed win. You have the situation where if the opponent could lose, meaning if for instance, you, Brian, if you and I were playing and you go, ha, 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 Dre, you only have a bishop. So in chess, it's impossible for me to checkmate you using only a bishop and a king. But let's say you still have a pawn left. And what happens is you run out of time and you go, oh, shame, good draw. And I go, well, actually, Brian, if you marched your pawn up the board and moved your king behind it and let me move my king up next to you and then let me check you with my bishop, it would be checkmate. And you could say, well, logically, I would never do that. That's absurd. Well, in FIDE, if that situation occurs, I actually get the win instead of a draw. And the reason that's hugely important is in the World Blitz Championship, which just happened, Magnus Carlsen won a game, going a game in regulation, basically, where that exact scenario happened. And that was the difference between him getting a win versus a draw. And because of that, he actually ended up in a tie-breaking procedure with Hikaru Nakamura, current defending U.S. chess champion. And Hikaru Nakamura lost basically in a tie-break procedure to Magnus Carlsen.
He's a blitz expert too, is that right, Trey?
So, and the last thing that gets really amusing here is we've talked about chess on the show before. And one of the things I brought up on chess versus other sports is a lot of times narrative street in sports is fun, right? LeBron James is in revenge game mode, right? Michael Jordan is going to, go in playoff mode, etc. And in chess, it's not to say that narratives don't matter at all, but usually the numbers are just going to back it, right? You're not going to expect, you're not going to expect a 3-1 upset a la the Golden State Warriors. And it's worth noting that the Golden State Warriors, albeit a 3-1 upset, is hyper rare in the playoffs. That was like the 4th out of 5 times it had happened in the last 3 years. And we've seen number 8 seeds defeat number 1 seeds. So these crazy upsets happen all the time in normal sports. They're less likely in chess. But one thing I will say to Narrative Street is heads up, Hikaru Nakamura, just apparently Magnus Carlsen has his number. And it could be, nerves. There is a difference between live chess versus whatever. And the reason you brought that up is like Hikaru Nakamura is, I think, one of the top blitz rated players in the world, if not the best blitz player, like online, for instance. But just over the board in person against Magnus Carlsen has a number. So that's the last point. We love chess because it's this perfect system, but occasionally these narrative streets do still fit in, and Magnus Carlsen just always beats Hikaru Nakamura.
Yeah, it's interesting. What this is reminding me of is this famous episode of Radiolab that we've talked about on the show before, stochasticity, I want to say. Is that the word? Let's
Stochasticity.
Yeah. So basically there's 2 stories I always, tell on the show that come from this Radiolab episode. One is about this girl, I want to say in the United Kingdom, who lets off a balloon and it flies, dozens or hundreds of miles away and lands in the yard of a girl that's the same age and has the same name as her. And you're like, wow, that's impossible. But they look into the numbers and, it's not really that uncommon. The other great example is they talk to a statistics professor who takes her students and divides them up into 2 different groups and says, one of you guys flip a coin 100 times or 1,000 times, something like that, and record the results. The other group, you make it up and do, a fake bunch of coin flips and, put those results down. And then I'm going to pick who I think was real and what's fake. She always picks the real random one correctly because the fake one does not have enough flips in a row, right? They try to make it look too random. So, yeah, what you're saying is, that's those rare things happen all the time in sports.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing is I had a fun example with that where I was talking to a statistician about football, and I brought that up, that turnovers in football are essentially random. Dave Barry's research has backed this, right? Turnovers are among the most important plays in football. Fumbles, interceptions, hugely swing the game, right? My Green Bay Packers, who, by the way, number 2 seed, first round bye, are I was going to say, actually, congratulations, preemptive shout out, Box Score Geeks. The Box Score Geek Show team, the San Francisco 49ers, the Green Bay Packers, number 2 seed in the NFC. So here's hoping for a conference game there, Brian. Although it's really weird to say this, but the Packers have the weakest quarterback situation with Aaron Rodgers, which is not a sentence I would ever have expected to say, but is the current situation. But I was talking to a football friend and was noting that turnovers are essentially random. And then we were kind of talking, well, maybe you could go through and maybe you would find a diamond in the rough, right? Some running back that was really turnover prone or turnover proof, right? And what the statistician brought up is you said, well, on the one hand, you could maybe say, oh, I found a really skillful player that's really valuable. On the other hand, I've heard this called like the Don Juan DeMarco point, where I guess Don Juan was like extremely lucky. But the point I've heard made about that is that if you just had a bunch of people do a bunch of stupid things, eventually one of them would get through and just be super lucky. And so the reason I've heard that called the Don Juan is, one really lucky person is going to happen. So if you find this really rare looking diamond in the rough running back who looks amazing or horrible, you just go, oh, statistically, one of those is going to happen, right? If I start with 30 teams with 2 running backs and I start winnowing them into someone who's going to get a turnover every week or not get a turnover every week, eventually I'm going to wind up with one that looks really special. They're not really special. They're just a statistical expectation. And so if I have a bunch of the top players in the world who, are like you were saying, like 50-50, eventually I'm going to see one string of win losses that just looks abnormal. And you're absolutely right. If we're viewing these as realistic weighted coins, and in these cases, I'm talking best in the world. So Hikaru versus Magnus Carlsen, these are like top 2, top 3 in the world at Blitz. Eventually, I'm just going to see a streak of like tails, right, for Hikaru. That doesn't mean that Magnus necessarily has his number. That's the narrative I'm using. That could just be statistically that was eventually bound to happen.
Yeah, this in other sports you can see this a lot too. Like baseball is a great example. There was this thing with Barry Bonds for a long time where people said Barry Bonds, one of the best, Hall of Fame players in baseball, but he never hits in the postseason at all. And what happened was he just ended up making a few more postseasons eventually as he got older into his career, and he just started hitting well. So it's just like, well, he just hadn't played enough postseason games, to have start hitting.
And I get really bugged in sports by things like on-off data, et cetera, that doesn't really make fair sample comparisons because there is a huge difference between playoff baseball and regular baseball. So in regular baseball, excuse me, Brian, getting over a cold. If 2 teams have a series against each other, it might only be a best of 3, right? It might be only 3 games. There might be weird things because don't forget in the regular season, if there's climate change has been causing us a lot, rain delay makeups, right? They might be doing a double header. There are different conditions. The playoffs have more rest between each game and who you're playing and it's a best of 7. So this gives the other teams lots of time to prepare. And, of course, in the playoffs, if you're going in the regular season, I might sit my star pitcher because I think they need more rest, or I might sit, Mike Trout because I think he just needs a day off. In the postseason, I'm going to be playing my best lineups. I'm going to be playing my best pitchers. My team is going to be hyper focused on studying for the team. And they made the playoffs, right? They're a better team than just the average the regular season. So it's really bizarre when people are like, people say he's the best, but he only does, he doesn't do great in October. And you go, well, it's 1, a different circumstance. And 2, like you're mentioning, it's a small sample. We've mentioned this point all the time. This is why 3-point shooters like Donovan Mitchell are notoriously hard to grade because a good 3-point shooter versus a bad 3-point shooter, and we're going to talk this with Kristaps Poringis, is essentially the difference of 1 3 per 10 attempts. And even in the modern NBA where some players are taking 10 plus threes a game, you have to watch an entire game and missing 1 3 is the difference between having a good game and a bad game. And that's really hard to remember. And you have to wait for, over the course of a month, a player that takes 5 threes a game. So let's say 3 games a week. That'd be, 12 games in a 12 to 15 games in a month, right, Brian? 5, that's 75 threes total that they're going to be taking. If I'm talking the difference of a couple of percent, that could be 4 or 5 threes over the course of a month. So that's like 1 3 a game I'm looking for. That is really, really hard to judge. And the same is true of like playoff baseball. I would ideally need to say them play in the playoffs every year for 10 plus games. And that's really hard to do because also, as we're kind of mentioning silly playoff systems, baseball has had some of these sillier playoff systems where, they're like best of 3 to play in or, single game play in. So you don't get to see Barry Bonds play super long playoffs every year to kind of judge his skill there. It's just small sample and can be expected. So I'm glad you keep your head on your shoulders about like statistical things can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if you're really cynical, maybe this is a bad example. Maybe Barry Bonds took a lot more steroids later in his career than earlier. But I think the point still stands. He was a Hall of Fame player before he took steroids and after as well. So he just, needed a few more games to average out.
And revisiting the steroid point, one of the things that's just frustrating is there are certain unscrupulous things in baseball history that we're willing to let pass. I'll give another shout out. Check out the Unpopular Opinion Network. They have a lot of great stuff, a lot of great shows. Their Patreon's like $5 a month, and I think he does about a show a day. Has a bunch of great ones, including some radio call-in shows. So he does a call-in show now, Brian, and I've been on it before. Nice. And if you're a patron, subscriber. He'll do like live streaming where you can comment. He has a big enough following that they actually have multiple people following the comments and actually read. So I've actually been on some unpopular opinion shows as a call-in listener, and then someone commenting in the chat room that they've listened to. So another bonus of you subscribing to the Unpopular Opinion Network. And to give a shout out to a specific sports show, which is why this is coming up, they have something called Jose Cansecast, where they read over Jose Canseco's biography, I think it's his autobiography, but it was assisted, obviously. Right. Read over that and do a lot of in-depth analysis. It's amazing stuff. And then, of course, they do bring up things like the steroid scandal that I think there are specific episodes that they've had on that as well. And they brought up that, getting mad at steroids and all this is really useful to kind of whitewash a lot of their history. Like literally, right? They used to be a segregated league. And then they used to basically just allow amphetamines. Yeah. So a lot of baseball doing this kind of puritanical thing towards steroids, I think, is to try and draw attention away from the fact that baseball's, perfect history is not so pure. And it's a lot easier to kind of scapegoat millennials, so to speak, even though that's not really millennials, than to kind of own up and say, oh, yeah, this game has never been perfect. People have always been gaining unfair edges, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's all kinds of crazy, violent people like Ty Cobb in the Hall of Fame as well. And I don't know, it's weird how in baseball some type of cheating is allowed and some isn't. Like players who scuff the ball or try to trap fly balls and fool the umpire, like that's considered to be okay, but steroids is not. I don't know. Baseball's code is super weird in my opinion.
And then I've heard other people on steroids note that, Tommy John elbow surgery, yes. Right? You're allowed to basically give yourself a bionic arm for all intents and purposes. You use like a dead person's ligament, but you're basically upgrading your arm. In a sport where having a good arm is really important because that's what happens. The reason pitchers can't go every day is they basically have to let their arm recharge. So some people are allowed to, upgrade their arms. Obviously, John Sally has brought this point up before, LASIK eye surgery. So John Sally, by the way, is a basketball player, but I've heard him bring this point up in regards to steroids that, getting LASIK eye surgery tremendously matters in sports. That's okay. So it's really weird that certain steroids aren't okay. And then also, I know Arturo's brought this up before, steroids can be useful in healing. And do we really want to say, hey, I'd rather have our star athletes, out another month as opposed to getting them back on the field sooner? So it is really weird as to what lines are drawn into what's okay in sports. And that's a topic I'm sure we'll hit on. We've hit on before and we'll hit on more, I'm sure.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, let's actually talk some basketball, Brian. So that's baseball for your people. This was amazing, Brian. This was like an amazing gift I wasn't expecting. So a couple of things happened. So some people were commenting on Kristaps Porzingis, particularly like Charles Barkley, going, it's a 7'3" center. Why should be a 7'3" center? I guess he's a stretch, whatever you want to call him, Brian. But Kristaps Porzingis, 7'3" player for the Dallas Mavericks, and Charles Barkley was wondering why he doesn't post up more. And was actually saying stuff, hate to be on Charles Barkley's side, Brian. He's a broken clock, so right some of the day. Basically was noting Kristaps Porzingis as a big is, taking away his advantage of being a big by basically trying to be a stretch three. And we agree. And then Coach Carlisle of the Dallas Mavericks came back and said a few things, and I'm going to give a huge shout out. If you need to pause this show and go watch it, go watch BBallbreakdown. And I'm trying to remember the title, Brian, because I didn't like the title of this video, but it's called "What Analytics Ruined in the NBA." So Coach Nick of BBallbreakdown goes over Coach Carlisle's comments, and then actually goes to both the tape and the analytics to back, to say what's going on there. And so anyway, Coach Carlisle said Kristaps Porzingis isn't effective posting up. 2, the post up isn't really effective. We'll get back to that in a second. That's not true. And 3, Kristaps Porzingis is an amazing three-point shooter, so it's more effective for him to take threes. Now, a few problems. 1, Kristaps Porzingis is not a great three-point shooter. Coach Nick gives a lot more credit than we would, in my opinion, which is he goes, if you look last year on the Knicks, Kristaps Porzingis shot close to 40% from three. Few important notes that we were just talking to start the show. And by last year, I mean 2 years ago, sorry. So 2 years ago on the Knicks, Kristaps Porzingis did actually shoot close to 40% from three. First, this is the best he had ever shot from three. 2, it was not over a complete season. So it was only over 48 games. So he was saying maybe he'll get back to that, but Porzingis before the Knicks had shot around 34% from three for his career, which in the modern NBA is bad. So first off, Kristaps Porzingis is not a great three-point shooter, has not traditionally ever really been a great three-point shooter for the full season. And so this was a bizarre comment for Coach Carlisle to be making. And during this season, Kristaps Porzingis has not been a great three-point shooter. Let's see. Let me just try and verify something really quick. You can go to NBA.com and actually examine what league average. League average three-point shooting for the season is 35.4%. So I'm sorry, 1% less than league average is not anywhere close to elite. So Kristaps Porzingis is not, is not actually a particularly great three-point shooter, as well as, he's actually good close to the rim. And I don't know if he should post up, but then on the post-up point, Coach Nick actually brought up another point, Brian, which is Luka Doncic is actually amazingly good from the post-up. And so this idea that Carlisle is saying that post-ups aren't good and that three-point shooting out of Porzingis were kind of false. But anyway, we were talking about Kristaps Porzingis, Rick Carlisle, and kind of this beautiful video from Coach Nick on analytics, because Rick Carlisle was trying to defend this idea of Kristaps Porzingis, and Kristaps Porzingis has been this fantastic player for years to us because he is a very classic mainstream versus us argument. And the irony is these players are starting to become few and far between. I want to take a brief detraction to talk about, like, the Wages of Wins group is sometimes called outspoken. And the reality is this is very partisan. It is very amusing to observe politics in this realm and to see it firsthand, because I find when I don't use wins produced by name, and when I use a lot of the analysis that is the underlying math in wins produced, people don't really have a problem with my takes. And some of the players that we even like Rudy Gobert, we all agree is great. We all think is great. LeBron James, we all think is great. All of us loved Luka Doncic. We all still love Luka Doncic. So many players that are accepted as great, we think are great, the math thinks is great. A lot of why people argue with us basically comes down to the fact that years and years ago, a guy was trying to get a job with the Nets and badmouthed his competition, and he viewed Dave Barry, creator of the wins produced metric, as his competition. And then this turns into very much coach trees like we see in football, where some of the people that he worked with and worked under went on and got jobs in NBA front offices and ESPN jobs. And that pretty much amounts to it, which, if it weren't so silly and related to me, it would be a little more funny. So actually I should have said it's very silly and should be funny. And if it, basically wasn't me, I'd find it hilarious. But so that is the case. But basically we're running out of players that basically mainstream analytics and us really disagree on. And one of the few is Kristaps Porzingis. And the reason is Kristaps Porzingis is a big that doesn't really do a lot of what bigs should do. He does block and defend, apparently, pretty well. But he doesn't get rebounds, and he doesn't really shoot. He doesn't have good shot selection. The numbers back that Kristaps Porzingis is really good at shooting up close. Years ago at Sloan, a company called Second Spectrum came over some data, and they noticed kind of two ways to analyze a player: how good they were when they did something, and how good they were at being able to do something. So as a funny example, Andrea Bargnani was a player that we thought was just terrible across the board. Their data actually said, hey, guess what? Andrea Bargnani is a fantastic defender and rebounder when he's in the right spot. He just never gets in the right spot because that's part of the skill, right? Being able to position yourself correctly in basketball, being able to take good shot selection, that is a skill in basketball. And Andrea Bargnani, despite being a 7-footer, was terrible at it. And Kristaps Porzingis is very much the same way. He's a tall player that the numbers say can shoot over 70% next to the rim when he gets next to the rim, but he doesn't take his shots next to the rim. And the numbers back that he's not really all that great from three. So he's a big that doesn't really do the things bigs should do to be productive. And unlike Dirk Nowitzki, who, from the same team that he's now on, he is not good enough at the other stuff to justify him not doing those big man things. Dirk Nowitzki in his prime was like an average big in regards to like rebounding, defense, and all that, but was a fantastic scorer, especially from outside, where I think I've made this point before, Brian, like I would love to see the modern D'Antoni in charge of the Mavericks teams with Dirk and Nash. And I think if they basically just went in and said, take 3 times as many threes as you're taking now, they would have easily won a title. That would have been amazing. Another player that came up across my radar recently, Brian, Sean Marion. Can you imagine Sean Marion in the modern NBA? I think he's a player that took like 2 or 3 threes a game, if I recall, but could shoot threes. He's this 3-and-D guy that like he would have been like Draymond Green on steroids, I think, had he basically taken more threes. So that would be another amazing player to see, in the modern NBA. Yeah, he averaged 2.1 threes a game, only 33% from three. I guess, in his prime, early days of the Suns, he was shooting, close to Kristaps Porzingis numbers. So that would have been interesting to see. So anyway, Kristaps Porzingis isn't that type of big though. And so when Carlisle is trying to defend it, it's wrong. And Coach Nick comes up with this great video and kind of notes that the post up is actually a pretty good play for getting threes. And this piece of analysis was so key. And it is one that I have brought up many, many times before in basketball analytics, which is just analyzing a player's ability to shoot a la Kobe and ignoring other things they can do is a ridiculous way to do it. And so what Coach Nick says is Luka Doncic posting up, excuse me. First off, he's a good post-up player. But second off, he's really good at ball handling, so he can also pass to cutters and or if players collapse on him as he's posting up, pass out to three-point shooters. And a point Coach Nick said, and I think I actually should follow up with him on this, he said three-point shots from post-up plays are among the best in the NBA, as well as second chance points from shots close to the hoop are among some of the best points. And I would say the bigger reason there is like if you're posting up and you take a shot, you're already at the hoop. So that's one extra rebounder that's there to try and get the putback basket if you miss. So there are lots of reasons to say the post-up play can be a positive play if we are viewing all potential outcomes of it. If I post up and I can't get the shot, if I pass to a cutter or pass to a three-point shooter, it's great. Or if I get a really good mismatch, I can make it. And a weirder point that Coach Nick made was that guards that are good at posting up, especially oversized guards, think Giannis Antetokounmpo, I know he plays power forward, but he can also play as a point guard, Luka Doncic, Ben Simmons. If you have oversized guards that are really good at posting up, that's potentially a really beneficial play. And this comes to a funny point because for years, you've noted that teams just don't play bigs traditionally. And if you do that, if you go for the small ball meme, you have to make it up somewhere. And what Coach Nick said that just kind of put a light bulb in my brain is I said, oh, you really should be trying to play guards bigger. And if you can get away with that, you get much more of an edge if you can get it. Because one of the points he made in a post up for Kristaps Porzingis is because Kristaps Porzingis is, really big and a big guy, right? So high center of gravity, so it's kind of hard for him to be mobile. And he doesn't have the best ball handling skills. If a guard's able to close out on him quickly, he basically ends up with a mid-range shot if he just takes the post up. And he's not great at ball handling, so he's not great at passing. Whereas if you get an adept guard that can post up, well, one, they've got good ball handling skills to pass. And two, then if they get in that position where they're closed out on quick, they might be able to maneuver around the guy quickly. So I loved this analysis from Coach Nick. And I love this take of taking a big and trying to make them into a stretch three might be less effective than trying to see if you can find guards that can occasionally do big man plays.
Yeah, it was a great video by Coach Nick. So what the video addresses is kind of a problem that I had with the Carlisle interview, or I guess it was a press conference more than an interview, where Carlisle was onto a nugget of truth, which I think is basically shooting from isolation out of the post up, which I think is how he interpreted the reporter's question, is a pretty bad play in the NBA. But then Coach Nick, dug a little deeper, like you said, and looked at, well, there's more outcomes to a post up than just an isolation play. And you pointed to a lot of good examples that he had. So yeah, this is why Carlisle is wrong, is because he has this nugget of truth, like I said, but he's just trying to defend himself and Porzingis, really, because it's like he started off with a good argument, but then he kind of goes astray, right? He said something like Porzingis is a historically great shooter, and as you said, he's clearly not. He's even below average. So I'm a little more complimentary of his defense. He was one of the worst players in the NBA. We were really down on him, but this year he's been a little better. He's actually upped his rebounding to being an above-average rebounder. Maybe not for a 7'3" player, but for bigs overall. He's still a good rim defender, but I do agree with you that he's a disaster on offense. A lot of turnovers, poor shooting, just should not be handling the ball and shooting as much as he does. So, yeah, that's why I think Coach Nick's video was so good, and why Carlisle was disappointing is he came close to getting somewhere near the truth, but kind of ran afoul.
And I think in basketball, ignoring that passing is an option is one of the biggest problems. And I think I was thinking about this the other day about analytics and Moneyball, aka baseball, as opposed to analytics in basketball. And I think the problem with analytics in basketball is they really just were not able to let go of players like Allen Iverson and Kobe Bryant. So the perfect comparable player I've heard of for Kobe Bryant in Major League Baseball is Derek Jeter. So Derek Jeter, very similar to Kobe Bryant, a very good player that was a key contributor to a major dynasty that won some key titles, right? And obviously a first ballot Hall of Famer. But if you were going to ask any baseball fan if Derek Jeter belongs, on the Mount Rushmore of, offensive players or whatever, they'd probably say no. Now, I don't know where he lands in shortstop land, and that actually is funny with Kobe Bryant, right? Where I think Kobe Bryant, nowhere near NBA's Mount Rushmore, but probably on the shooting guard Mount Rushmore, although some excellent shooting guards, like James Harden, are going to start making that more difficult. If we get another good one or two, that'll definitely be weird in the future. But in baseball, saying Derek Jeter is not one of the greatest of all time was no problem. I have Basketball on Paper behind me, and in that book, Dean Oliver is defending Allen Iverson's MVP, which is egregious. Now, ironically enough, years later, when Dean Oliver is not trying to get an NBA job briefly, he did end up with the Wizards recently, but when Dean Oliver wrote Basketball on Paper, his goal was ostensibly to send out a proof of his work to a bunch of NBA teams to try and get hired, which didn't end up happening. He ended up getting hired by the Seattle Supersonics, rest in peace. In that book, he basically was not willing to go against Allen Iverson. Years later, when he was out of NBA work for the time being, he wrote an article about why Russell Westbrook didn't deserve NBA MVP for his triple doubles. And I was shocked and amazed, because I was reading it. He was going, why could anybody think that Russell Westbrook's games are, good? Who would think this? Or who would think he's the best offensive player? And I was like, I could go to Basketball on Paper, and the reasons people could justify Russell Westbrook taking lots of shots inefficiently, or why he doesn't shoot efficiently on his team without other players. You made up fake curves in Basketball on Paper to justify players like this. And that's kind of the point. In basketball, saying that Kobe Bryant and Allen Iverson were overrated at the beginning of basketball analytics in the 2000s, those players were sacrosanct, and you had to find some way to still say they were okay. We had a funny feud. Well, we had an ongoing feud with Neil Payne over at 538 for years, and he'll occasionally take jabs in his article at us. And at one point was the advanced analytics had to come around to prove Kobe was as good as we thought he was. So it's the analytics movement in basketball has been people trying to dig through the numbers to try and find ways to say players that the numbers don't like are actually as close to good as that. And Kristaps Porzingis is one of these weird players where I think there's just still a divide where the numbers don't like him, and people just have to dig and dig and dig to try and find ways. And it's saying he's a 7-footer who can shoot threes is kind of all that's left for him.
What I think he's a DeMarcus Cousins type of player, that he does good things that you like to see in the numbers, but he does bad things as well that hurt you. And it kind of just evens out to him being a mediocre, below average player. And that's good for him. He was really bad even before. So Cousins, hey, he's still playing in the NBA. He's been hurt, unfortunately, but he's had an up and down career, had some good years, but generally just never got there, right? And I would not be, even though Porzingis is young, I would not be surprised if he took the Cousins career path, had some injuries, have some good upside, do some really good things, but just do too many bad things and not be a productive player in the end. And let me just say that the thing we always like to say here is Porzingis is doing the stuff that got him paid a maximum contract, right? So from his business perspective as a professional, he's done all the right things. But we would just say it's not winning basketball, unfortunately.
Do you want me to go hyper geeky with a metaphor I've been thinking on this?
Okay, well, we have to do it now.
Although it's kind of a shame because she's becoming more and more problematic as time goes on. But the comparison I'm going to make for how we analyze basketball is Quidditch in Harry Potter.
Oh, God.
You ready for this?
Okay.
I'm going to keep going. Stop. So Quidditch is a made-up game that J.K. Rowling made up for a Wizarding World in Harry Potter. And kind of the key distinction I would say about Quidditch is there are really three games going on at once. There are two racers basically looking for a golden snitch that's worth a lot of points. There's kind of a basketball lacrosse game going on where people are trying to score against a goalie. And then there's like dodgeball going on where these people are allowed to hit balls at the other people playing. So you've got three games going on at once. And the thing is, if you didn't know the rules from the outside, it could be really bizarre to watch what was going on because there are all three of these people are responding to different rules, right? Harry, we might watch this game and go, this guy really sucks, right? He's just running around in circles and he's not trying to, put the ball through the hoop or get open or defend. What's this person doing? Or, man, why do these people keep throwing this ball through the hoop instead of trying to tag the other people out with the ball? There are three games going on. And watching basketball a lot of times is like that because the incentives of coaches, front offices, owners, and players can all be different. And so when we're all trying to grade on the same curve, right, going like, why doesn't Kristaps Poringis try and win a title? Right. That's our argument. Well, you just have to come back and go, his incentive might not be to win a title. His incentive might be, and probably should just be, get in the best market and get paid. And we can't really fault that, right? He is a professional basketball player. One thing that we've always kind of laughed about when people get upset with players not being all gung-ho for titles is the odds of winning a title are tremendously low. The circumstances to get a title have to be just right. And even go back to point one, they're still low, right? There have been some great teams that were constructed that had an amazing shot at a title, and things just kind of fell apart. Case in point, the Milwaukee Bucks last year, right? If Kawhi doesn't sign with Toronto, Milwaukee probably waltzes to an NBA championship. As it is, they end up losing to Kawhi being absurd, and then the same thing happens to the Warriors, right? The Warriors might have won a title as well if, Giannis isn't in Milwaukee and Kawhi isn't in Toronto, but life is what it is. So players have this incentive to get paid, and it makes a lot of sense. And so when you start viewing them through that lens, it makes a lot more. And then the last kind of just weird capper on that is also there's a lot of egos involved, both on players, owners, coaches, et cetera, in this field where it gets amusing, where you basically go, these people are trying to get paid while at the same time, trying to defend themselves against criticism. The Carlisle point, right? Carlisle, for what it's worth, as a he is an esteemed NBA coach. Maybe he's good, maybe he's not. Well, if your front office dumps a $30 million a year player that remember last year when they acquired him from New York, they were like laughing and saying, oh, we didn't even have to give up a first round pick to get him. This was a coup. So the front office clearly thought Kristaps Porzingis was a star. You give him to Carlisle. Is Carlisle really going to be able to say, this guy sucks, I don't want to play him?
That's right.
Or is to keep his job, right? Carlisle is one of the highest paid NBA coaches, and even most esteemed NBA coaches can be fired. So like Carlisle has to play this guy while simultaneously explaining why he's a great player, and then also explain why he's not doing good at the things you'd want him to do good at. Like that's a fine tightrope to watch. And so when you start trying to view the incentives of the different agents in all of these games, sometimes things get a little more clear. And yeah, Porzingis wants to get paid. Carlisle doesn't want to lose his job. That on its own can explain this press conference.
Yeah, and apparently he bullied Nate Jones after he asked a sarcastic question or something like that. So I don't know. Yeah, Carlisle is probably wrong here in general.
I'm gonna have to look that up. I mean, it is you've noted that being acceptable, and we just don't agree with it. Where it is annoyingly acceptable for this weird mentality of coaches to bully reporters or be very standoffish, especially when in the realm of questions that they're asking are pretty tame. We're going to stay out of politics on our commercial break. We just got depressed, so we're going to stay out of that. But, one of our complaints about politics forever has been the mainstream media's kind of inability to do a good job of probing questions and deep analysis and proper coverage. And so in the NBA, where people are asking these stupid, innocuous questions and coaches think it's acceptable to like come back and insult them, it's actually somewhat frustrating because we're going, this is an area where it should be perfectly fine for, a reporter to ask Kevin Durant, where are you going next season without it being a big deal?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to get into that Durant thing too much, but as we talked about recently, it turns out that Durant's reaction to that question ended up telling us a lot about the situation.
Yeah. And funny note, that also gets stupid too. Let's give a shout out to Dwayne Dedman, who complained he wanted out of the Sacramento Kings this week and was fined $50,000. So there's also this annoying, when we're talking incentives, there's this other weird incentive where you can be fined for stuff you say, but you're also required to say it. And so, like, it's kind of dumb, right? The incentive is I yell at a reporter, I don't get fined. Whereas if I'm honest with a reporter, I can get fined. The incentives are laid up for some stupid, stupid stuff there.
Yeah, not to mention Dwayne Dedman has probably not made as much money in his career as other players, so it's a much bigger hit for him than someone else.
If I mean, 50,000 is 50,000.
Yeah.
I was going to say, do you have anything to cap off Porzingis? I think we can talk David Stern, and then I'll say there's lots of NBA news, but I'm going to just say we've had a long enough show. We can do David Stern, and that can be our show.
Yeah, let's go to Stern. I guess that's a big topic.
I want to take a high level and uncomfortable take on David Stern, which I think I've seen both Kevin Draper and now Henry Abbott take. I think David Stern is a very American story, and something that I would love more Americans when we review history and great figures to take the stance on, which is to say, David Stern was an incredibly productive person who was incredibly important in the history of basketball that also had problematic areas, particularly related to race. And that almost seems perfectly American as some kind of metaphor for something. You know, as I've mentioned this last year, I was on a Hamilton kick because it came through Appleton. So, read the Hamilton biography, and you go down the history wormhole, and you just go, all of these founding fathers that we all grow up learning great things about. When you introspect, you discover there were largely problematic aspects of them in regards to race. And that's kind of ingrained in the United States DNA, for better or for worse. And so, like, when I saw David Stern's death, I was like, obviously, historical figure has passed, and I just went, wow, that's almost incredibly poignant, right? Like I said, that's like seems almost as an American figure as you can get, a modern day American figure that kind of represents the zeitgeist of 300 years of American history. That was kind of my big takeaway. And then I did see some people, Kevin Draper, bringing up stuff like that, bringing up the dress code, bringing up the response to the Malice and the Palace, bringing up that David Stern, when pressed on race, said, yeah, I get called, having a plantation mentality every time we end up in collective bargaining agreements, and kind of just saying that nonchalantly, that kind of stuff coming up. So, is what it is. What we will say, and the credit that we've given David Stern before, is before David Stern, the NBA was not really a star-driven league. It was a team-driven league, right? It was trying to go for football. We're going to go the Lakers versus the Celtics. And I can't remember if Draper's piece or Henry Abbott was bringing up this point, but I know Dave Barry's brought this up before. David Stern really came into the league and said, we're going to focus on stars, and then got some tremendous luck. This is what is always required for phenomenal success, is luck. He came in and said, I'm going to make this a star-driven league, and he had an 80s of Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, followed by Hakeem Olajuwon and Michael Jordan on the wings. And, we got what we got. So an unfortunate death, an amazing figure with some problematic parts of his thing. I think the Kevin Draper at New York Times piece on him is probably the best, and the Henry Abbott piece on him is pretty good as well.
Yeah, I'm not a New York Times subscriber, so I did not read the Kevin Draper piece, but I read some of his stuff on Twitter. I did read Henry Abbott on True Hoop. There's also, I was chatting with you about this, there's now a True Hoop podcast, so Henry Abbott may do a podcast on David Stern sometime this week. I haven't seen it come out yet, but anyway, yeah, so I'll just comment maybe on Henry Abbott's stuff more, is that, yeah, on the economic side, Stern, of course, did grow the league tremendously. Something like 30-fold revenue increase is the number I saw. Like you said, brought in the star era, the TV era. Excuse me. I shouldn't have eaten during that break. But, yeah, so he does have that, big economic legacy that we need to put out on the show. The thing that I did not realize that, I learned from Henry Abbott is not just these kind of, troublesome business decisions, like you said, the race problems, Donald Sterling and all that. Henry Abbott just portrays him as just a classic, abusive CEO, just a really nasty person, basically. And just kind of everyone knew that he was like that. So we had another big media figure Don Imus, an 80s and 90s radio figure, just died, and the same things were said about him. You know, so I'm not trying to say Stern was as bad a guy as Don Imus necessarily, but a lot of those stories are coming up, right? Abbott used the comparison of to Lee Iacocca, the Chevrolet / GM CEO back in the 80s, who was a tyrant basically, right? So yeah, that's a really unfortunate legacy that Stern has. Just not as a very good person, unfortunately.
And what I really do think that's important. I think I heard Daveed Diggs, who played Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson in the original Broadway run of Hamilton. When he was talking about it, he said the reality of these great figures is they can have done amazing things, but they can still have problematic aspects. Alexander Hamilton, as an example, was largely influential in founding this nation's financial system. He also screwed a tremendous number of people that fought in the Revolutionary War out of their money, and then did kind of a Republican thing that I've seen happen. I should be a little more fair. I've seen lots of people do this. It's more prominent in the Republican Party because they follow this line, but I'll say a lot of people try and do the just world thing where they want to explain why they're right for doing something kind of villainous, and the Republican to be the one that goes the more fiscal route a lot. So you have to explain why you're right for, taking monies from babies. But Alexander Hamilton, what ended up happening is a bunch of fighters in the Revolutionary War sold essentially their ownership of promissory notes for future pay. And so Alexander Hamilton later, basically said, we're gonna pay that, but we're not gonna actually pay it back to the original people. And people said, well, these people fought in the war. They had nothing to live on. This is ridiculous. Can you really justify not finding a way to pay the original people that fought just because during the war, all they really had was this piece of paper that was meaningless, and they tried to get something out of it, and then they still fought the entire war. Are you really going to screw them out of any money whatsoever? And his logic was just like, well, that just shows they didn't have faith in the nation. Now, you can make an unpopular decision and say, for financial purposes, this is infeasible, which he did say, right? Like it is impossible to track down every promissory note back to its original person. This would be completely infeasible. It would completely destroy the plan that we're trying to do. They were an early nation at the time, so they wasn't like the modern US where they have a bunch of money. But at the same time, you don't have to try and morally justify a decision that has pragmatic backing. And then irony, he gave up his own back pay, and his wife, after he died, found a way to get his back pay back. So is what it is. So, she was much smarter than him. One of the funny things about Alexander Hamilton, by the way, is he came up with this brilliant financial system that, is like founded the basis of the United States credit system, and then was tremendously bad with money on his own. And his wife basically had to find ways to get his house at a bargain after he died, so she was still able to stay there and then pay it back. Like I said, back pay. So it's funny stuff, right? Where you have these, it's very much like modern athletes. You have a player like Michael Jordan who is amazing at playing basketball, and you go, you are an amazing basketball player. Can you coach a team? Can you run a team? And it's like, no, those are slightly different skills. So it's like, can you manage the nation's capital? Absolute capital is in money. Absolutely. Can you manage your own money? Absolutely not. So funny stuff there.
And of course, history would repeat itself, Dre, not, maybe 100 years after that or so. Our favorite general, Smedley Butler, marched with the bonus army after World War I to try to get their money that they were promised for fighting in World War I. So apparently Hamilton and the United States did not learn their lesson the first time around.
It's funny. We do. I think we've mentioned him twice now. We are going to have to find time, when we're not talking chess, to give Smedley Butler more time on the show, because he is a fascinating figure. Yeah. And sorry, just finishing back with Sterling, I think the best obituaries, like Henry Abbott and Kevin Draper, are the ones that say, this is an amazing figure that did great things, but there are many problematic aspects, and can we please, as mature adults, through the lens of history, look at both, because that's important, because when you start leaving off those aspects, the very baseball thing we were talking at the beginning. Baseball tries to hide all of the warts from its early days, and as a result, finds ways to mess up modern eras and modern narratives. So
just real fast, I'll read Henry Abbott's headline: "Exceptional, ruthless. David Stern doesn't fit tidy eulogy." So yeah, there you go.
I like it. And oh, by the way, last note to finish that up on, you were mentioning you might listen to the True podcast. I was curious if you had any thoughts or reviews on it, because I have liked Henry.
No, I don't think it's out yet. But he said there's going to be one, so I'm watching for it. Yeah, that's going to be exciting if that starts up.
All right, so we'll keep our ears posted, because of the podcast I listen to, I already promoted the Unpopular Opinion. I don't necessarily listen to a lot of basketball ones now, especially when you do a basketball podcast. It's not like that's the most popular, but True Hoop is one I would be interested in listening out for. Yeah, I have a few just basketball like shout outs I can give to end the show, Brian. If you've got anything you want to say about the NBA, I think we missed it on one of the off weeks, but your Warriors did find a way to shut down James Harden.
Yeah, they're looking good. They won 3 games in a row. They've since lost a few. They barely lost to San Antonio the other night, and they're playing again in Minnesota tonight. I think they're kind of losing there, but yeah, they're starting to get healthy again. And we talked about this last time. They got to trade D'Angelo Russell. They got to get one of these big men that are available. So we'll see what they do. Light Years is on life support. We'll see. We'll see what happens with Light Years the rest of the season.
And I've just got to say, Michael Porter Jr. and Nikola Jokic in Denver are looking great. Yeah. I'm very excited to see where that lands. And my take that Luka Doncic can be MVP is still looking like a good take. We'll try and talk more official NBA next week. We'll find NBA-specific topics to discuss that aren't so somber.
Yeah, Luka is back and healthy and playing again. That is great news.
Yeah, one of the best players in the NBA. We absolutely love it. All right, well, I'm going to take us out, Brian. That's been the Box Score Geek Show. If you found us not through the website, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. We go live typically on Mondays at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, unless it's a travel week, a holiday week. Hopefully we get some regular shows in with the new year and less holidays with that. I've been your host, Jay Alvarez, a.k.a. Nerd Numbers, co-host Brian Foster, a.k.a. Box Score Brian on Twitter. The Box Score Geek Show on iTunes and Stitcher. Subscribe, upvote, helps us out, and channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube if you want recaps. I think I got all the main stuff there, Brian. If not, we'll talk about it next week.